This podcast is a proud member of the Lamb Podcasting Network. Find the network at largeassmovieblogs.com.
Hello and welcome to episode 85 of the 1001 Movies podcast, based on the book 1001 Movies You Must See Before You Die. I'll be starting out with season 8 of the podcast with 1931's Little Caesar, directed by Mervyn LeRoy and starring Edward G. Robinson.
So, somebody finally put one in you.
Yeah, but they just grazed me, though.
The old man will be glad to hear it. He takes such an interest in you.
You tell them the cops couldn't get me no other way, so they hired a couple of gunmen.
If I wasn't on the force, I'd have done the job cheap.
Hey, did you ever stop to think how you'd look with a lily in your hand?
No, I never did. I've been in this game a good many years, and I put the cuffs on a lot of mugs. Someday you and I are going to take a ride, Rico. And when we do, I'll have the cuffs on you, too.
No buzzard like you will ever put any cuffs on Rico. Come on, boys.
In the 1920s, author W.R. Burnett worked as a night clerk at the Northmere Hotel in Chicago. During that time, he observed the comings and goings of a number of seedy individuals who were probably involved in some not-so-legal activities. Burnett wrote a number of unpublished stories inspired from his experiences, but his book Little Caesar became his first published work in 1929. The novel was about the rise and fall of a Chicago gangster, and for all intents and purposes, it was a very loose biography of Al Capone, Chicago's most famous mobster. The rights to the book were bought up by First National Pictures, which later became part of Warner Brothers. Little Caesar was not to become the first gangster picture. 1915 saw the release of The Regeneration, directed by Raoul Walsh, about a boy who grows up to be a powerful mobster kingpin. There was also the short film The Musketeers of Pig Alley, directed by D.W. Griffith and released in 1912, about a man who comes face to face with the same man who robbed him and his wife. The late 1920s also saw films like Underworld and The Docks of New York. Warner Brothers was keen on the genre, preferring to leave the romantic realism and fairy tales to the other studios, so it was no wonder they took a shine to Little Caesar, a grim morality tale with an unpleasant protagonist. The film was about Caesar Rico, played by Edward G. Robinson, who starts off as a small-time crook with his friend Joe, played by Douglas Fairbanks Jr., and eventually murders and robs his way up to be a celebrated crime boss. All of this eventually comes to an end, with Rico becoming a homeless alcoholic before being tracked down by the police, who take him down in a blaze of gunfire. Mervyn LeRoy, who had just finished making his first dramatic film, Numbered Men, and who had worked his way up from a wardrobe attendant to an actor and finally to a director, was chosen to direct Little Caesar. It would end up making his career. One of LeRoy's first requests was to have Clark Gable in the film, although whether he wanted him to play the role of Rico or Joe was unclear. Instead, Jack Warner, who thought Clark Gable's ears were too big, insisted on getting Edward G. Robinson, probably because he saw Robinson play a crook the year before in The Widow from Chicago. Making a film about a gangster in the early 1930s wasn't as easy as you would think, although it would be a few years until the Hays Code was strictly enforced, even though it did exist at the time Little Caesar was made. Much of Hollywood looked down on the studio for glorifying crime, but Jack Warner persevered and even released another gangster film, The Public Enemy, just 3 months after Little Caesar. However, there was still a drop of controversy with the script, in which Rico's dying words were, "Mother of God, is this the end of Rico?" This line caused some of the studio's brows to furrow, and the line was eventually changed to, "Mother of Mercy, is this the end of Rico?" Warner didn't have an issue of glorifying gangsters, but taking God's name in vain was apparently a different matter. Little Caesar became, of course, a critical success, although it was not without its detractors who panned the film for glorifying violence and crime. Part of its success is attributable to the early period of talking pictures in which audiences were thrilled with the actual sounds of machine guns firing, brakes squealing, and glass shattering. Yes, it certainly was a more innocent time. It did manage to snag a single Academy Award nomination for Best Writing Adaptation, although the screenwriters lost out to Cimarron. Mervyn LeRoy went on to have a lucrative career with movies like I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang and Gold Diggers of 1933, both of which are topics for future episodes. It was Edward G. Robinson who really came out on top after Little Caesar, and he spent the rest of his career trying to play off his performance as Caesar Rico, although the film is arguably his most famous, perhaps after Double Indemnity. What did I think of Little Caesar? At a scant 79 minutes long, the story can be summarized in 2 sentences. The acting, with the exception of Robinson in the lead, is subpar, the direction is unimaginative and static, and the film suffers from dialogue that ranges from the wooden to the overly dramatic. That being said, I loved watching this. It may be the poor grandfather of The Godfather, but that doesn't mean it isn't charming to the last. The obvious crown of the jewel is Edward G. Robinson, whose portrayal I thought was going to be a hokey gangster stereotype. In truth, it's this movie that invented the stereotype. This is the film that invented the language and idiosyncrasies of movie gangsters that are imitated at costume parties even up until today. People think that 1920s gangsters used words like malls and mugs and bulls, when in reality they probably talked like everyone else. And it was Little Caesar that literally invented these terms being attributed to the stereotype. Robinson's performance encapsulates all the silly gangster tropes, but he's just so damn fun to watch that I looked beyond the stale story and enjoyed watching him. Scenes without Robinson are few and far between, but if they lasted longer than a minute or two, I kept yearning for the camera to return to Caesar Rico. The film's biggest offenders in terms of acting are Douglas Fairbanks Jr. and Glenda Farrell as his girlfriend Olga, whose scenes together are as corny as Kansas on the 4th of July. Little Caesar has been called an anti-American dream story in that it features a man who achieves the fame and fortune that are the American dream, although he does it by stealing and killing. This was the first in a long line of stories with the same theme, most notably the Godfather films, Goodfellas, and television dramas like The Sopranos and Breaking Bad. In the midst of the Great Depression, audiences seemed to embrace Caesar Rico, not because he was a bad man, but he could be the subconscious scapegoat for a society that was struggling through the worst financial crisis at that point. There is no denying that Little Caesar, while certainly not being the first gangster film, set the standard for all gangster films that followed. It shares this with William Wellman's The Public Enemy and Howard Hawks' Scarface. Curiously, these other 2 films focused on prohibition and the smuggling of booze, framing its mobsters like Robin Hood providing the masses with booze. Like all good gangster films, of course, part of the fun is being able to peek behind the curtain and see what it's like on the dark side, despite the fact that much of this is Hollywood taking its liberties. For instance, after Rico has his colleague Tony killed, he shows up at the off-screen funeral with the biggest wreath of them all. It's little details like this that make us think that there really is honor among thieves, and maybe Rico isn't such a bad guy after all. It was all business, nothing personal. Don't think too hard about it, though, because Tony left behind a loving mother we meet in a scene before his death, but the script doesn't have the legs to show her emotional fallout after Tony's death. How the film managed to be nominated for Best Writing without giving Edward G. Robinson an acting nod is beyond me, and if it sounds like I hated the film but for Robinson's performance, then I should probably emphasize that this movie is above average, and you could undoubtedly do many worse things with 79 minutes of your life. That's all I have to say about Little Caesar. Tune in next week when I talk about 1949's The Reckless Moment, directed by Max Ophüls. In the meantime, feel free to email with any comments or questions at 1001moviespodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter at 1001moviespc. Until next time, happy viewing.